Mrs. Dorothy Williams dropped her coffee mug, the ceramic shattering against her kitchen floor as she stared through the window at the motionless German shepherd chained in the neighboring yard. The dog wasn't sleeping. Rex's chest barely rose and fell in the suffocating 95-degree California heat. It wasn't the first time she'd seen him collapse, but this time felt different. Her arthritic hands trembled as she reached for the phone, years of minding her own business crumbling in an instant. The elderly woman had watched this beautiful animal waste away for 5 long years, 3 feet of rusted chain, his entire world, counting each day by the desperate scratches he'd carved into the wooden fence post. 20 years ago, that same dog had helped save a little girl from a burning house just 3 blocks away. 911? There's a dog dying in my neighbor's backyard, and I can't stay silent anymore. How much time did Rex have left? And would anyone believe what she'd witnessed all these years? The secret acts of love hidden behind apparent cruelty? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The sirens cut through the afternoon stillness of Riverside County's Oak Haven neighborhood, where manicured lawns and white picket fences had always promised the American dream. But behind the facade of suburban perfection, darkness had festered for half a decade. Rex had once been magnificent, a German shepherd whose intelligent amber eyes could read human souls and whose powerful frame embodied everything noble about his breed. Now, at 7 years old, he was a shadow of that former glory. His black and tan coat hung in patchy clumps, revealing scarred skin beneath. Ribs protruded through matted fur, and his once bright eyes had dulled to a cloudy resignation. Yet even in his diminished state, Rex maintained the alert ears and protective posture that marked him as extraordinary. The 3-foot chain that bound him to a rusted metal post had worn a perfect circle in the hard-packed earth, a prison measured not in bars, but in the precise mathematics of despair. For 5 years, 2 months, and 14 days, this circle had been Rex's entire universe. Marcus Mitchell pulled his dented Honda Civic into the driveway just as the animal control van arrived. At 35, Harold Mitchell's son carried the weight of the world in his slouched shoulders and calloused hands. His police uniform had been replaced years ago by the wrinkled shirts of a man working 3 jobs. Uber driver by day, security guard by night, weekend delivery driver when desperation demanded it. The foreclosure notice taped to his front door told the story of a man drowning in debt, $3,000 behind on mortgage payments that seemed to multiply faster than his minimum wage paychecks. What neighbors didn't know was that Marcus had been secretly spending $400 each month from his dwindling savings account on veterinary bills for the dog he claimed to despise. His bedroom dresser held receipts for antibiotics, pain medication, and emergency treatments, evidence of a contradiction that would baffle anyone who witnessed his apparent cruelty. Sarah Chen emerged from her silver Toyota Prius with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to saving lives. At 28, the veterinarian possessed an ethereal beauty that masked steel-hard determination. Her long black hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her scrubs bore the honorable stains of her profession. Sarah had built her entire adult life around a single driving force, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. She lived alone in a tidy craftsman bungalow 3 blocks away, where framed photographs of rescued animals covered every surface, and her refrigerator held more dog treats than human food. Her parents' weekly phone calls invariably ended with gentle pressure about marriage and grandchildren, conversations that left Sarah feeling simultaneously loved and misunderstood. Mrs. Dorothy Williams watched from her kitchen window as the drama unfolded, her weathered hands clutching the phone she'd used to make the call that would change everything. At 72, She represented a generation caught between old-fashioned propriety and modern moral obligation. Her husband's death 3 years earlier had left her surviving on Social Security checks and the diminishing comfort of routine. The collision of these four lives, broken dog, struggling man, determined woman, and guilty witness, would soon reveal secrets that had festered in Oak Haven's perfect facade. The confrontation erupted the moment Marcus stepped out of his car. Sarah Chen stood beside Rex's motionless form, her veterinary training immediately cataloging the signs of severe distress, shallow breathing, elevated heart rate, and the telltale stillness of an animal conserving what little energy remained. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Marcus's voice cracked with exhaustion and something that might have been panic. His work shirt was soaked with sweat from a 12-hour security shift, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who hadn't slept properly in months. Sarah didn't flinch. "This dog is dying of heat stroke and dehydration. I'm a licensed veterinarian, and I'm taking him for emergency treatment." She knelt beside Rex, her hands gentle as she checked his pulse. The German Shepherd's breathing was so labored that each exhale seemed like it might be his last. "You can't just take someone else's property," Marcus shot back, but his protest lacked conviction. He stood frozen at the edge of Rex's worn circle, unable to step closer. Even in crisis, an invisible barrier seemed to separate him from the animal he'd kept chained for 5 years. The animal control officer, a weathered man named Bill Hendricks, consulted his clipboard with bureaucratic precision. "Sir, we received a complaint about animal neglect. I need to assess the situation and determine if immediate intervention is necessary." Mrs. Dorothy emerged from her house moving with surprising speed for her age. "That dog hasn't had fresh water in 2 days," she announced, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "I've been watching from my kitchen window and I can't stay quiet anymore." "You don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, but his defensive posture suggested otherwise. His hands trembled as he fumbled for his keys, and Sarah noticed the way he avoided looking directly at Rex. Sarah's examination revealed the full scope of Rex's condition. His gums were pale and sticky, indicating severe dehydration. His body temperature was dangerously elevated, and she could feel his ribs through skin that hung loosely over his diminished frame. Most concerning was his complete lack of response to her touch. A German Shepherd should have been alert and protective, but Rex lay motionless, as if he'd simply given up. "This animal needs immediate fluid therapy and cooling treatment," Sarah declared. "Without intervention in the next few hours, he'll die." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, his face draining of color. "He's not. I've been taking care of him. I pay for his shots, his medicine." "What medicine?" Sarah's professional instincts sharpened. Something in Marcus's defensive response didn't align with the evidence before her. Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He pulled a crumpled receipt from his wallet, a veterinary bill dated just 2 weeks earlier for antibiotics and pain medication. The total was $347, paid in cash. Sarah stared at the receipt, confusion replacing her initial anger. Why would someone paying for expensive veterinary care leave their dog chained without basic necessities? Bill Hendricks stepped forward with the authority of someone who'd seen too many cases of animal abuse. "Sir, regardless of medical care, keeping a dog on a 3-foot chain in this heat constitutes neglect under California law. I'm issuing a 72-hour emergency removal order." The announcement sent shockwaves through the small crowd that had gathered. Neighbors emerged from air-conditioned homes, drawn by the sirens and raised voices. Some nodded in approval, while others whispered among themselves about property rights and government overreach. Marcus's reaction was immediate and visceral. "No, you can't take him." He moved toward Rex for the first time since arriving home, then stopped abruptly as if hitting an invisible wall. His breathing became rapid and shallow, sweat beading on his forehead despite standing in shade. Sarah watched this strange dance of approach and retreat with growing bewilderment. Marcus clearly cared about Rex's fate, yet couldn't bring himself to touch the animal he claimed to own. Mrs. Dorothy had seen enough. "Young man," she addressed Marcus with the authority of her 72 years, "your father loved that dog more than his own life. Harold would be heartbroken to see what you've done." The mention of Harold Mitchell's name changed everything. Marcus's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like a lost child rather than a grown man. "You don't understand," he whispered. "None of you understand what I'm trying to protect him from." Sarah knelt beside Rex again, this time noticing something she'd missed in her initial assessment. Despite his terrible condition, the dog's collar was clean and recently adjusted. His nails had been trimmed and there were no signs of external parasites. Someone had been providing at least minimal care. The mystery deepened when Rex suddenly lifted his head at the sound of Marcus's voice. His cloudy eyes focused with difficulty, but his tail gave the faintest wag, a sign of recognition that contradicted everything Sarah thought she knew about their relationship. "There's more to this story," she murmured to herself. But time was running out. Rex needed medical attention immediately, and the legal clock had started ticking the moment Animal Control issued their order. The Riverside Animal Hospital's treatment room hummed with controlled urgency as Sarah worked to stabilize Rex. I-4 fluids dripped steadily into his dehydrated system while cooling mats lowered his dangerously elevated body temperature. The German Shepherd lay motionless on the steel examination table, his breathing gradually becoming less labored but his eyes remaining distant and unfocused. "His vitals are improving," Sarah told her assistant Maria while checking the monitors. "But there's something else going on here. This level of depression isn't just physical, it's psychological." Marcus had followed the ambulance to the clinic, despite Bill Hendrick's warnings about interfering with an active animal control case. He sat in the waiting room, alternately pacing and slumping in plastic chairs, his hands shaking as he filled out endless paperwork that might determine Rex's fate. The first breakthrough came when Sarah decided to attempt the procedure that would become the emotional centerpiece of Rex's recovery, his first bath in 5 years. She had seen the matted, foul-smelling condition of his coat and knew that proper hygiene was essential for healing. What she didn't expect was Rex's reaction. As the warm water first touched his fur, Rex's entire body went rigid. Sarah paused, expecting fear or aggression, but instead witnessed something that would haunt her for weeks. The proud German Shepherd began to tremble, not with cold or terror, but with an emotion so raw and human-like that Sarah gasped. Tears, actual tears, began flowing from Rex's cloudy eyes as memories seemed to flood back. "Oh my God," Maria whispered, stepping closer. "I've never seen anything like this." Rex wasn't fighting the bath. He was remembering. His trembling intensified as Sarah's gentle hands worked through his matted coat, and soft whimpers escaped his throat, sounds of grief rather than pain. For 5 years, no human hand had touched him with kindness, and the sensation unlocked something deep within his traumatized psyche. Sarah found herself crying too, understanding instinctively that she was witnessing more than a dog's first bath. This was a reconnection with his lost identity, a remembering of what it meant to be loved and cared for. Rex allowed her touch without resistance, his amber eyes gradually clearing as if awakening from a long, terrible dream. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. As the filthy water swirled down the drain, carrying away years of neglect, Rex's true coat began to emerge, still patchy and scarred, but revealing the magnificent animal he had once been. More importantly, his demeanor shifted. The defeated resignation lifted slightly, replaced by cautious hope. Meanwhile, in her modest kitchen 3 blocks away, Mrs. Dorothy Williams was making a phone call that would shatter everyone's understanding of the situation. Her arthritic fingers dialed a number she hadn't used in 2 years, reaching Harold Mitchell's former attorney. "Mr. Patterson, this is Dorothy Williams. I think it's time you told that young veterinarian about Harold's will. Yes, the trust fund. She needs to know what Marcus has been dealing with all these years." The legal revelation that followed would prove to be the first of many shocking discoveries. Attorney James Patterson arrived at the animal hospital within an hour, carrying documents that painted an entirely different picture of Rex's situation. Harold Mitchell established a $500,000 trust fund specifically for Rex's care, Patterson explained to Sarah in the clinic's small conference room. The terms were very specific. Marcus would inherit the family home and remaining assets only if he provided appropriate and loving care for Rex until the dog's natural death. Sarah's mind reeled. $500,000? But then why? "There's more," Patterson continued grimly. "If Rex died of illness or injury while in Marcus's care, the entire trust would be donated to animal rescue organizations. Harold was very concerned about ensuring Rex lived out his natural lifespan." The cruel irony was staggering. Marcus had been struggling financially, working multiple jobs and falling behind on mortgage payments while sitting on a fortune he couldn't access without meeting conditions that seemed impossible, given his obvious fear of the dog. But the deepest revelation was yet to come. As Sarah processed this information, Mrs. Dorothy appeared at the clinic's entrance, carrying a worn shoebox filled with photographs and documents. Her weathered hands trembled as she opened it, revealing images that would change everything. The photographs showed a very different story than anyone had imagined. Harold Mitchell and Rex were pictured together in dozens of scenarios: training sessions, quiet moments by the fireplace, and most significantly, therapeutic interventions. Harold had severe PTSD from his service in Vietnam, and Rex had been specifically trained as his emotional support animal. "Harold wasn't just a veteran," Mrs. Dorothy explained, her voice thick with emotion. "He was a former FBI K-9 handler before the war. Rex wasn't just a pet. He was a highly trained working dog who saved Harold's life every single day." The final photograph in the collection stopped Sarah's heart. It showed a much younger Harold Mitchell and Rex standing outside a burning house with a small Asian girl, no more than 8 years old, safe in Harold's arms. On the back, someone had written, "Sarah Chen, age 8, rescued from 412 Maple Street fire, March 15, 2004. Sarah stared at the photograph, her hands shaking as 20-year-old memories came flooding back. The kind man who had carried her to safety, the large dog who had somehow found her hiding under debris, it had been Harold and Rex all along. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She owed her life to the very dog she was now fighting to save, and the man who had rescued her had been Rex's beloved companion. The chain of connection ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The weight of revelation settled over the animal hospital like a heavy blanket as Sarah stared at the photograph that connected her life to Rex in ways she had never imagined. 20 years collapsed into a single moment of recognition. The smoky chaos, the strong arms that carried her to safety, and the large dog whose bark had guided rescuers to her hiding place under fallen beams. "Harold never told you, did he?" Mrs. Dorothy asked gently, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Sarah. "He made me promise not to say anything. Said some gifts are meant to be anonymous." Sarah's professional composure cracked completely. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the faded photograph, understanding now why she had felt such an immediate, inexplicable connection to Rex. Her entire career path, dedicating her life to saving animals, had been unconsciously motivated by a debt she never knew she owed. "He saved my life," she whispered, her voice breaking. "And I let Rex suffer for 5 years without knowing." Mrs. Dorothy's weathered hand covered Sarah's. "Child, you couldn't have known. Harold was very particular about keeping secrets. But there's more you need to understand about Marcus and why things became so twisted." The full story began to unfold as Mrs. Dorothy opened another section of her memory box. More photographs revealed the complex dynamics of the Mitchell family: Harold's struggles with PTSD, his dependence on Rex for emotional stability, and most painfully, the growing distance between father and son as the dog became Harold's primary source of comfort. "Marcus was 10 when Harold brought Rex home," Mrs. Dorothy explained. "Just 2 weeks after that terrible incident with the Henderson's Rottweiler down the street." Sarah looked up sharply. "What incident?" "Marcus was attacked while walking home from school. 47 stitches on his left arm and shoulder. The boy was traumatized, afraid of every dog he saw. And what does Harold do? Brings home a German Shepherd puppy, saying the family needs protection." The psychological complexity of the situation became clearer with each detail. A traumatized child, fearful of dogs, watching his father pour love and attention into the very type of animal that had hurt him. Rex had healed Harold, but inadvertently destroyed the father-son relationship. "Harold never understood," Mrs. Dorothy continued sadly. "The more Rex helped with his nightmares, the more Marcus felt replaced. The boy would bring home report cards, sports trophies, anything to get his father's attention. But Harold was always with Rex, training him, talking to him, sleeping with him in the living room when the dreams got bad." Meanwhile, back at the Mitchell house, Marcus sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the foreclosure notice while emergency veterinary bills piled up on the table. His phone buzzed constantly with updates from the animal hospital, each message a reminder of his failure to care for the one thing his father had loved most. The internal war that had raged within Marcus for 5 years was tearing him apart. Every fiber of his being recoiled from Rex due to his deep-seated canine phobia, yet his conscience demanded he honor his father's final wishes. The chain had been his compromise, keeping Rex alive and technically cared for while maintaining enough distance to manage his own psychological triggers. But there was another layer to Marcus's behavior that no one suspected. Hidden in his bedroom closet was a journal he'd been keeping for 5 years, documenting Rex's condition with the meticulous attention of someone who genuinely cared. Daily notes about the dog's eating habits, mood changes, and physical symptoms painted a picture of devoted, if distant, caretaking. "Day 1847, read one recent entry. "Rex didn't finish his food again. Took him to Dr. Williams for blood work. Results normal, but he's losing weight. Called 3 different dog behaviorists, but they all want to see him in person. Can't do it, can't get close enough. Hate myself for being such a coward." The journal also revealed Marcus's growing desperation about the trust fund conditions. Harold's will required appropriate and loving care, but how could Marcus demonstrate love when he couldn't even touch the animal? He'd been trapped in an impossible situation, trying to keep Rex alive while remaining too terrified to provide the affection that might unlock his inheritance. Sarah's discovery of this psychological complexity coincided with a medical breakthrough in Rex's treatment. As his physical condition stabilized, she began to notice behavioral patterns that suggested his training was still intact, despite years of isolation. When she accidentally dropped a metal instrument, Rex immediately went into an alert position, scanning for threats. When a child cried in the waiting room, his ears perked up with the attentiveness of a working dog. "He's not broken," Sarah realized aloud as she watched Rex respond to environmental stimuli. "He's just dormant, like a computer in sleep mode, waiting for the right command to wake up." This observation led to another shocking discovery. While reviewing Harold's training notes, which Mrs. Dorothy had preserved, Sarah found references to specific verbal commands that Rex had been trained to recognize. On impulse, she tried one: search and comfort. Rex's transformation was instantaneous. His ears snapped to attention, his cloudy eyes focused with laser intensity, and he attempted to stand despite his weakened condition. The working dog that had been buried under years of neglect suddenly surfaced, eager to perform the job he'd been bred and trained for. The implications were staggering. Rex wasn't just a pet, he was a highly specialized therapy animal whose skills could help other trauma victims. His value went far beyond the monetary trust fund. He represented years of training and natural ability that couldn't be replicated. This realization prompted Sarah to make a controversial decision. Against the advice of her clinic staff and the explicit warnings of animal control, she decided to bring Marcus and Rex together for a supervised interaction. If Rex was truly a therapy dog, perhaps he could help heal the very person who had been afraid of him. The meeting was arranged for the following evening at the animal hospital. Marcus arrived pale and shaking, his hands visibly trembling as he entered the treatment room where Rex lay recovering. Sarah had prepared for this moment by researching techniques for overcoming canine phobia, but nothing could have prepared her for what actually happened. Rex sensed Marcus's presence before seeing him. The dog's entire demeanor shifted, not to aggression or fear, but to a focused alertness that Sarah recognized from the training videos. Despite his weakness, Rex struggled to stand, his instincts telling him that someone in the room needed help. Marcus froze in the doorway, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow as childhood trauma collided with present reality. But Rex, operating on 5 years of pent-up purpose, began performing behaviors that Harold had trained him to recognize signs of human distress. The dog moved slowly, deliberately, positioning himself at a distance that wouldn't trigger Marcus's flight response, but close enough to provide comfort. He lowered his body to appear less threatening, kept his eyes soft rather than making direct contact, and began the rhythmic breathing pattern he'd been trained to demonstrate for anxiety sufferers. He's trying to help me," Marcus whispered, his voice filled with wonder and confusion. Sarah watched in amazement as Rex performed his therapeutic duties despite his own physical weakness. The dog who had been chained and neglected was setting aside his own needs to care for the person who had caused his suffering. It was a demonstration of forgiveness and purpose that left everyone in the room speechless. But the emotional breakthrough was interrupted by a phone call that would change everything. The caller identified himself as Dr. Michael Torres from UC Davis Veterinary School, and his message was urgent. "I've been following Rex's case through professional networks," Dr. Torres explained. "There's something you need to know about German Shepherds with his specific training background. We've been studying a syndrome that affects retired working dogs, a form of depression that mimics physical illness but is actually psychological. If I'm right about Rex's symptoms, his condition might be completely reversible with the proper intervention." The conversation that followed revealed that Rex's apparent decline might not be from neglect alone, but from a psychological condition called retired working dog syndrome. Without his job to perform, highly trained dogs like Rex could literally waste away from purposelessness, their symptoms appearing identical to serious physical illness. "The chain might have actually saved his life," Dr. Torres explained, his words hitting the room like a bombshell. "By keeping him in one place, your friend prevented Rex from escaping to search for his deceased handler. Many dogs in similar situations run away and die trying to find their lost partners." Marcus collapsed into a chair, the full weight of irony crushing down on him. His cruelty had been accidental kindness, his fear had been protective instinct, and his failure to love had somehow kept alive the one thing his father treasured most. The medical emergency struck Rex without warning on a sweltering Tuesday morning as thunderclouds gathered over Riverside County. Sarah had arrived early at the clinic to check on his progress when she found him convulsing on the treatment room floor, his breathing erratic and his eyes rolled back in apparent terror. The storm outside was triggering memories buried deep in his traumatized psyche. Harold's nightmares had always been worse during thunderstorms. "Code Blue, I need the crash cart now," Sarah shouted as she dropped to Rex's side, her hands moving with practiced efficiency to check his vitals. His heart rate was dangerously elevated, his body temperature spiking despite the climate-controlled environment. This wasn't just a physical crisis. It was a complete psychological breakdown. Maria rushed in with the emergency equipment as the first rumble of thunder shook the building. Rex's convulsions intensified with each sound, as if his body was fighting battles that existed only in his traumatized mind. Sarah realized with growing horror that without immediate intervention, they might lose him not to his physical ailments, but to the emotional wounds that had never healed. "Call Marcus," she ordered while administering emergency sedatives. "And get Dr. Torres from UC Davis on the line. We need to know exactly what Harold trained Rex to do during storms." The call to Marcus found him at his morning security job, where he was monitoring empty office buildings for minimum wage while dreading the evening's mortgage payment deadline. When his phone rang with Sarah's panicked voice explaining Rex's condition, the world seemed to tilt sideways. "He's having flashbacks," Sarah explained breathlessly. "The thunder is triggering something, but we don't know his specific training protocols." "What did your father do when Rex had episodes like this?" Marcus's throat closed up completely. He'd spent 5 years avoiding any deep knowledge of Rex's training, unable to bear learning about the bond between his father and the dog that had replaced him. Now that willful ignorance might cost Rex his life. I don't know," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Dad never let me close enough to see their sessions. He said I wouldn't understand." The admission hung between them like a death sentence. Marcus could hear Rex's distressed whimpering through the phone, and the sound pierced through decades of built-up resentment and fear. For the first time since childhood, he found himself wanting desperately to help a dog rather than hide from one. "There has to be something," Sarah pressed. "Think, Marcus." "Any detail, any routine you might have observed from a distance." Marcus closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember the nights when his father's screams would wake the entire house. He'd always covered his head with pillows, trying to block out the sounds of Harold's torment and Rex's responsive actions. But now, desperate to save the animal he'd spent years trying to protect in his own broken way, he dug deeper into those painful memories. "Music," he said suddenly. "Dad always played this old song during the bad nights. Something about coming home, and he would hold Rex while they both lay on the living room floor until the episode passed." Sarah's mind raced as she processed this information. "What song? Can you remember any lyrics?" "Shenandoah," Marcus replied, surprised by the clarity of the memory. "The old folk song about going away across the wide Missouri." Dad said it reminded him of peaceful rivers instead of the jungle sounds that haunted him. Within minutes, Sarah had found the song on her phone and was playing it softly in the treatment room. The effect on Rex was immediate and profound. His convulsions began to subside as the familiar melody reached his ears, his breathing gradually stabilizing as muscle memory took over from panic. But the crisis was far from over. Dr. Torres arrived by emergency helicopter from UC Davis, his expression grim as he assessed Rex's condition. The psychological episode had triggered a cascade of physical problems. His heart was severely stressed, his breathing remained labored, and his already weakened immune system was failing. "We need to perform emergency surgery to address the cardiac complications," Dr. Torres explained to the assembled group in the clinic's waiting room. "But I have to be honest with you. The procedure costs $15,000 and there's no guarantee of success given his overall condition." The financial reality hit Marcus like a physical blow. His last savings account contained exactly $16,000, money he'd been hoarding for the final mortgage payment that might save his childhood home. The choice was stark and immediate: save Rex or save himself from homelessness. Sarah watched Marcus's face cycle through emotions: fear, resentment, desperation, and finally, something that looked like acceptance. She saw him calculating not just the money, but the weight of his father's disappointed spirit and his own 5 years of guilt and self-loathing. "Do the surgery," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was sacrificing. "Use whatever money you need. I'll figure out the house situation later, Mrs." Dorothy, who had been sitting silently in the corner, stood up with surprising authority. "Now hold on just a minute," she announced, pulling out her cell phone. "Before anyone starts making noble sacrifices, let me make a few calls." What happened next would become legendary in Oak Haven's history. Mrs. Dorothy's first call was to her neighbor Janet, who ran the community Facebook page. Within 15 minutes, the story of Rex's crisis and Marcus's impossible choice was spreading through social media like wildfire. The narrative of a young man sacrificing his home to save the dog he'd been too afraid to love captured the community's imagination. The second call was to Pastor Williams at Oak Haven Methodist, who agreed to open the church basement for an emergency fundraising meeting. The third was to Channel 7 News, where Mrs. Dorothy's friend's granddaughter worked as a producer and owed the elderly woman a favor for decades of free babysitting. While Rex underwent emergency surgery, a small miracle was unfolding in the community outside. Neighbors who had spent months judging Marcus for his treatment of Rex began to understand the complex psychological forces that had created the situation. The story resonated with veterans who understood Harold's struggles, parents who recognized Marcus's childhood trauma, and anyone who had ever felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The surgical procedure lasted 6 grueling hours. Dr. Torres worked with Sarah to repair damage to Rex's heart while simultaneously addressing the psychological trauma that had triggered the crisis. The approach was unprecedented, combining traditional veterinary medicine with animal psychology techniques that treated Rex not just as a patient, but as a retired working dog whose purpose needed to be restored. Marcus spent those 6 hours in the waiting room, watching through the windows as news crews arrived and neighbors gathered in the parking lot. Signs appeared: "Save Rex," "Support Marcus," and "Honor Harold's memory." The community that had once whispered about the chained dog was now rallying to support both animal and owner. Sarah emerged from surgery exhausted but cautiously optimistic. "He made it through," she announced to the crowd that had gathered. "The next 24 hours will be critical, but his vital signs are stable." The cheer that went up from the assembled neighbors was audible through the clinic walls, reaching Rex in his recovery cage where he lay unconscious but breathing steadily. For the first time in 5 years, the German Shepherd was surrounded not by isolation and silence, but by a community united in hope for his survival. The 24 hours following Rex's surgery became the darkest period in what was already a tragic story. Despite the successful operation, complications arose that no one had anticipated. Rex's body, weakened by years of psychological trauma and physical neglect, began rejecting the medical interventions that should have saved his life. Sarah found herself living at the clinic, monitoring Rex's vital signs around the clock as his condition deteriorated. The German Shepherd lay motionless in the recovery cage, his breathing shallow and irregular, his eyes closed as if he had simply decided to surrender the fight. The community's hopeful vigil in the parking lot began to take on the somber atmosphere of a death watch. "His body is giving up," Dr. Torres explained to Marcus during a brutal 3 a.m. consultation. "We've done everything medically possible, but there's something beyond our reach here. It's as if he's lost the will to live." Marcus stood outside Rex's cage, his hands pressed against the metal bars, finally understanding the devastating irony of his situation. For 5 years, he had kept Rex alive through fear and obligation, maintaining just enough care to prevent death while being too terrified to provide the love that might have prevented this moment. Now, when he was finally ready to try, it might be too late. The breaking point came when Sarah made the phone call no one wanted to hear. Rex's kidneys were failing, his heart was struggling despite the surgery, and his brain activity suggested a complete withdrawal from consciousness. The veterinary consensus was clear: they were prolonging suffering rather than promoting healing. "We need to consider euthanasia," Sarah said, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. "It's the kindest thing we can do for him now." The legal complexity of the situation made even this final mercy complicated. Marcus had signed custody over to Animal Control to access the trust fund for emergency surgery, but the temporary guardianship agreement required unanimous consent from all parties for end-of-life decisions. Sarah, as the treating veterinarian, had to agree. Mrs. Dorothy, as the reporting party, had to consent, and Marcus, as the legal owner, had to sign the papers. But Marcus couldn't do it. Despite 5 years of keeping Rex at arm's length, despite the fear that had defined their relationship, he found himself unable to make the decision that would end the dog's suffering. His hands shook as he stared at the euthanasia consent form, paralyzed by the weight of choosing death for the animal his father had loved more than life itself. "I can't," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I can't be the one who kills Dad's dog. Even if it's the right thing to do, I can't live with that." The community that had rallied around Rex's story began to fracture under the weight of this impossible decision. Social media posts that had been filled with hope and encouragement turned angry and judgmental. Some neighbors accused Marcus of prolonging Rex's agony for selfish reasons. Others argued that euthanasia was giving up too easily on an animal who had already survived so much. Sarah found herself caught in the middle of increasingly hostile debates about animal rights, veterinary ethics, and the responsibilities of pet ownership. The story that had started as a simple rescue case had evolved into a community-wide moral crisis that reflected deeper divisions about suffering, mercy, and the value of life itself. Mrs. Dorothy, watching the chaos unfold from her kitchen window, made a decision that would shock everyone involved. She called a meeting at her house for all the principal parties: Marcus, Sarah, Dr. Torres, and Bill Hendricks from Animal Control. What she revealed in that meeting would change everything they thought they knew about Rex's situation. "Harold made me promise to keep this secret until it was absolutely necessary," she began, pulling out a sealed envelope from her memory box. "But watching that poor animal suffer while you all argue about what's best for him, I think Harold would want you to know the truth." The envelope contained Harold's final letter, written just days before his death, when he must have sensed his time was running short. The letter revealed the most devastating secret of all. Rex was not just Harold's therapy dog. He was Harold's suicide prevention partner, trained specifically to detect when Harold was contemplating self-harm and to intervene with life-saving behaviors. "Rex saved my life 147 times," Harold had written in his careful script. "I counted every intervention, every moment when his training pulled me back from the edge. I owe him everything, and I failed him by not helping Marcus understand that Rex's love is different from human love. It's pure and unconditional and healing in ways that medicine can't touch." The letter went on to explain that Rex's apparent surrender might not be medical failure, but a grief response to Harold's death that had never been properly addressed. Rex wasn't just sick, he was heartbroken, and all the medical intervention in the world couldn't heal a soul that had lost its purpose. "If Rex is dying," Harold's letter concluded, "it's not because his body has failed, but because his heart believes his job is finished." Show him that there are still people who need saving, and he might remember why he was born to serve. The silence that followed Mrs. Dorothy's reading was deafening. In trying to save Rex's life, they had focused entirely on his physical symptoms, while ignoring the emotional wound that was killing him from the inside. Rex wasn't refusing medical treatment. He was refusing to live in a world without purpose. Harold's letter changed everything. But the revelation that shattered all previous assumptions came from an unexpected source. Dr. Torres, who had been quietly reviewing Rex's medical files while the others processed Harold's words, looked up from his laptop with an expression of stunned disbelief. "I need to show you something," he said, his voice tight with suppressed excitement. "I've been comparing Rex's blood work from 5 years ago, when Harold was still alive, with his current tests. The pattern of decline isn't consistent with the diseases we've been treating." Sarah moved to look over his shoulder as Dr. Torres pulled up side-by-side laboratory results on his screen. The data told a story that contradicted everything they had believed about Rex's condition. "These aren't the markers of a dog dying from neglect or even psychological trauma," Dr. Torres explained, pointing to specific values highlighted in red. "This is a dog whose body has been in a state of suspended animation, conserving energy and maintaining basic functions while waiting for something or someone." The medical revelation was staggering. Rex hadn't been dying for 5 years. He had been hibernating, his highly trained mind putting his body into a survival state while he waited for Harold to return. The chain that everyone had seen as cruelty had actually prevented Rex from exhausting himself in a futile search for his deceased handler. "But that's impossible," Sarah protested. "Dogs don't hibernate, and his symptoms were real. The weight loss, the lethargy, the apparent illness." "Not hibernation in the biological sense," Dr. Torres clarified, "but something unprecedented in veterinary literature. Rex's training was so extensive, his bond with Harold so complete, that his body literally didn't know how to exist without his handler's commands. He's been waiting for 5 years for Harold to tell him what to do next." Marcus, who had been silently absorbing this information, suddenly understood the full tragedy of the situation. "The chain," he whispered, his face pale with realization. "I thought I was protecting him from the outside world, but I was actually preserving him, keeping him in place, until Harold came back." Mrs. Dorothy nodded slowly, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Harold knew he was dying, even if he wouldn't admit it to anyone else. He trained Rex to wait, to stay, to preserve himself until the next phase of his mission could begin. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As Dr. Torres continued reviewing the medical records, he discovered something that made him question everything they thought they knew about Rex's identity. Hidden in Harold's veterinary files was a registration document that had been overlooked for 5 years. "Rex isn't just Harold's name for this dog," Dr. Torres announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rex is his official designation. He's not a retired therapy dog. He's a retired federal working dog. His full registration reads, Canine Officer Rex, serial number 4471, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Explosive Detection Division." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Sarah felt her knees weaken as the implications sank in. Rex wasn't just a trained therapy animal, he was a federal agent whose specialized skills were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in training and whose retirement benefits were protected by federal law. Harold wasn't just a Vietnam veteran, Mrs. Dorothy confirmed quietly. Before the war, he was one of the FBI's top K-9 handlers. Rex was his partner for 8 years before Harold's PTSD forced them both into early retirement. Marcus stared at Rex's motionless form in the recovery cage, finally understanding why his father had loved this dog with such intensity. Rex wasn't just a pet or even a therapy animal. He was Harold's former partner in the most literal sense, a fellow law enforcement officer who had shared dangers and saved lives alongside his handler. The federal implications of Rex's status began to dawn on everyone present. As a retired federal working dog, Rex's care and treatment were governed by specific laws that superseded local animal control authority. More importantly, his training and abilities were considered national resources that couldn't simply be euthanized without federal oversight. "We need to contact the FBI's K-9 retirement program," Dr. Torres said, reaching for his phone. "If Rex is who these documents say he is, his case requires federal intervention." But Sarah had a different idea, one inspired by Harold's final letter about showing Rex that people still needed saving. "What if we don't wait for federal bureaucracy?" she suggested. "What if we give Rex what Harold said he needs? A purpose, someone to save." The plan that emerged was unprecedented in veterinary medicine. Instead of continuing traditional treatment, they would attempt to reactivate Rex's working dog instincts by presenting him with a scenario that required his specialized skills. If Harold was right about Rex's condition being emotional rather than physical, the right stimulus might literally bring him back to life. Marcus, despite his lifelong fear of dogs, volunteered for the most crucial role in this experimental treatment. "If Rex is dying because he thinks his job is finished, then I need to show him there's still work to do. I need to show him that I'm someone who needs saving." The ethical complexity of the plan was staggering. They would essentially be using psychological manipulation on a dying animal, potentially causing more stress in the final hours of his life. But the alternative, watching Rex slowly surrender to depression, seemed equally cruel. Sarah prepared the treatment room to simulate the kind of emergency scenario that would trigger Rex's protective instincts. She dimmed the lights, played recorded sounds of distress, and positioned Marcus in a way that would appear threatening to a trained security dog if he were to suddenly awaken Rex. The moment of truth came when Marcus, his hands shaking with 25 years of accumulated fear, approached Rex's cage and spoke the words Mrs. Dorothy had taught him from Harold's training notes. "Rex, I need help. Search and protect." The response was immediate and miraculous. Rex's eyes snapped open with a clarity that had been absent for years. His head lifted, his ears pricked forward, and every muscle in his weakened body tensed with sudden purpose. The dying dog transformed instantly into the federal agent he had once been, his training overriding his physical limitations. But the most stunning reversal came when Rex's medical monitors suddenly showed dramatic improvements across every category. His heart rate stabilized, his breathing deepened, and his neurological responses sharpened as if someone had flipped a switch in his brain. "My God," Dr. Torres breathed, watching the real-time data scroll across his screen. "His body is responding to the psychological stimulation. Everything we thought was organ failure was actually shutdown protocols." He was conserving energy until he received activation commands. Marcus found himself face to face with Rex for the first time in 5 years, the dog's intelligent amber eyes fixed on him with laser-like intensity. But instead of the fear that had defined their relationship, Marcus felt something entirely different: respect, understanding, and the beginning of the bond his father had always hoped they would share. "Good boy, Rex," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I understand now. You were never just a dog. You were Dad's partner. And now, you're mine." Rex's tail, which hadn't moved in weeks, gave the faintest wag, a sign of recognition and acceptance that marked the beginning of their new partnership and the end of 5 years of mutual misunderstanding. The transformation in Rex was nothing short of miraculous, but the real healing began in the weeks that followed as Marcus slowly learned to overcome 25 years of canine phobia. The process was painstaking and often painful, requiring Marcus to confront not just his fear of dogs, but his resentment toward his father and his own sense of inadequacy that had festered for decades. Sarah designed a careful rehabilitation program that addressed both Rex's physical recovery and Marcus's psychological barriers. They started with simple proximity exercises, Marcus sitting across the room while Rex rested in his recovery bed, gradually moving closer each day as both man and dog grew comfortable with their new dynamic. The breakthrough moment came 3 weeks after Rex's emergency surgery, when Marcus was finally able to place his hand on Rex's head without panic overwhelming him. The German Shepherd's response was gentle and patient, as if he understood the courage this simple gesture required. For the first time since childhood, Marcus felt the therapeutic power that his father had found in Rex's presence. Mrs. Dorothy watched their progress from her kitchen window, her heart swelling with pride as she witnessed the healing that Harold had always dreamed would happen between his 2 boys. The community that had rallied around Rex's crisis gradually dispersed, but not before leaving behind something precious, a network of support that had transformed Marcus from an isolated, struggling man into someone with genuine connections to his neighbors. The financial crisis that had threatened Marcus's home was resolved through an unexpected source. The FBI's K-9 retirement program, once notified of Rex's status, provided retroactive benefits that covered not only his medical expenses, but also established a monthly stipend for his ongoing care. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Marcus's inheritance came not from his father's will, but from Rex's federal service record. But the most significant change wasn't financial. It was personal. As Marcus learned to care for Rex properly, he discovered reserves of compassion and patience within himself that he hadn't known existed. The daily routine of feeding, grooming, and exercising Rex became a meditation on responsibility and love that gradually healed wounds Marcus hadn't even realized he carried. Sarah found herself visiting the Mitchell house frequently, ostensibly to monitor Rex's medical progress, but increasingly because she enjoyed watching the bond develop between man and dog. Her professional interest evolved into something deeper as she witnessed Marcus's transformation from a fearful, bitter young man into someone capable of profound gentleness. The relationship that grew between Sarah and Marcus was built on their shared love for Rex and their mutual understanding of loss and healing. Sarah had spent her career saving animals as a way of honoring the debt she owed to Harold and Rex, while Marcus had spent years punishing himself for never being the son his father wanted. Together, they found a way to honor Harold's memory that neither could have achieved alone. Rex's recovery accelerated once he was back in his familiar environment, but this time with love instead of fear defining his care. His coat regrew thick and lustrous, his weight returned to healthy levels, and most importantly, his purpose was restored. Marcus enrolled them both in a therapy dog certification program, planning to honor Rex's legacy by helping other veterans struggling with PTSD. The chain that had bound Rex for 5 years was ceremonially removed during a community gathering in the Mitchell backyard. Mrs. Dorothy cut the final link with bolt cutters while neighbors applauded, and Rex walked his first free steps in years with dignity and grace befitting his status as both retired federal agent and beloved family member. But perhaps the most profound moment of healing came when Marcus discovered a letter his father had written specifically for him, hidden in Rex's federal registration papers where Harold knew it would only be found if his son ever truly accepted the dog. The letter, dated just days before Harold's death, contained the apology and explanation that Marcus had needed for 25 years. "Son," Harold had written, I know you think I loved Rex more than you, but that was never true. Rex helped me survive my demons so I could be a better father to you. I was afraid my nightmares and anger would damage you the way war damaged me. Rex was my medicine, but you were always my heart. I pray that someday you'll understand that my love for him was really love for you, love for the future we could have together, once I learned to be whole again. The letter explained that Harold had always planned for Marcus and Rex to eventually bond, but his sudden death had prevented the gradual introduction he had envisioned. The trust fund and care requirements weren't tests of Marcus's character. They were Harold's desperate attempt to keep his family together until natural healing could occur. 6 months after Rex's near-death experience, the transformation was complete. Marcus had not only overcome his fear of dogs, but had become an advocate for animal therapy programs. He and Rex began visiting the local VA hospital, where Rex's training and gentle temperament helped other veterans process their own trauma. Sarah opened a satellite clinic specializing in therapy animal training, with Marcus as her partner in developing programs that paired retired service members with rescue dogs. Their work attracted national attention, and they found themselves frequently interviewed about the healing power of the human-animal bond. Mrs. Dorothy, now 83 and experiencing her own health challenges, moved in with Marcus and Rex, creating the multi-generational family that Harold had always envisioned. She spent her days teaching neighborhood children about responsible pet ownership while watching Rex play with young visitors in the backyard that had once been his prison. The final healing came on the anniversary of Harold's death, when Marcus, Sarah, and Mrs. Dorothy held a memorial service in the Mitchell backyard. Rex wore his old FBI collar for the ceremony, and Marcus read aloud from his father's letters, finally understanding that love multiplies rather than divides when it's shared freely. As the sun set over Riverside County, Rex ran freely across the grass he had watched from the end of a chain for 5 years. Marcus threw a tennis ball with hands that no longer shook with fear, while Sarah documented their progress for the therapy dog program that would become Harold's true legacy. The chain was gone, the trust fund was irrelevant, and the fear that had defined 2 generations of the Mitchell family had been replaced by love, purpose, and the understanding that healing often comes through service to others. Rex had found his new mission. Marcus had found his courage, and together they had discovered that redemption is always possible when hearts are finally open to receive it. Sometimes the chains that bind us aren't made of metal. They're forged from fear, misunderstanding, and the weight of expectations we never knew how to meet. Rex's story reminds us that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to, and healing rarely follows the timeline we'd prefer. Marcus spent 5 years believing he was protecting Rex through distance, when what they both needed was the courage to bridge the gap that fear had created between them. How many of us have relationships trapped by invisible chains, family members we've grown distant from, friendships we've let wither, or parts of ourselves we've kept locked away because vulnerability feels too dangerous? Harold's final letter revealed a truth that transforms everything. Love multiplies rather than divides when we have the courage to share it freely. Rex's transformation from a chained, forgotten animal to a purposeful therapy dog mirrors our own potential for renewal at any stage of life. We're never too late to rewrite our stories, to choose connection over isolation, to discover that our greatest wounds can become our most powerful tools for healing others. Sometimes what we think is an ending is actually a beginning. We just need to be brave enough to cut the chains and run free. What invisible chains might be holding you back from deeper connections with those you love? Have you ever discovered that someone's seemingly hurtful actions were actually their way of protecting you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.